Hello, this is Amin, and you are watching session 26 of ASP.NET Core tutorial. In this session, we are going to talk about attribute routing. If you remember, in session 12, we discussed about routing, which was conventional routing. And generally, we have two types of routing, conventional routing and attribute routing. Until this session, we used conventional routing, and in this session, we discuss in detail about attribute routing. Let's flip to Visual Studio and continue our discussion. This is the project that we have been working so far throughout this tutorial, and let's go to a startup class and configure method, which is the place that we can set the conventional or attribute routing. This is the way that we use conventional routing, and we have controller, action, or ID, or name. This is the custom routing that we can set, and we can add more item, optional, or mandatory option. Or even for conventional routing, we can use endpoints, which is map default controller route. And if I set map default controller route and see the detail of this endpoint routing, you can see it is exactly the same as route that I entered in map controller route. It is controller and action and ID as optional. This line of code is exactly equal this line of code before the name, which is optional that I entered, but I can omit it. And this is the conventional routing, and we discussed it in detail in session 12. And we discussed how conventional routing is working. But in this session, we switch to attribute routing to show you how attribute routing is working, and also what is the differences between the conventional routing and attribute routing. But before switching to attribute routing, I should mention that attribute routing is preferred routing for web API web application, but for regular MVC application, conventional routing is better practice from my point of view. Let me comment these lines. For commenting lines in Visual Studio, you can select the lines and press Ctrl K and then Ctrl C. And let me switch to attribute routing. For switching to attribute routing, I should use endpoints.map controllers, and now it is attribute routing. But before adding attributes to my controllers and action method, let's run the project and see the result when I switch to attribute routing. As you can see, as I switch to attribute routing, when I run the project, I receive 404 error as I don't have any default routing. And also, if I route to home index, still I receive 404 error. At this moment, we should enter attributes route to my controllers. This is home controllers. And for enter routing, I should use route attribute and then enter the name or the path that I should use. For the situation that I want to use a default action method and default controller, I can use this path. It means when I type just the domain name, this action method will appear and the view of this action method will present. And the next route is when I go to just a domain name and home, and the next route that I should enter is home index. Let's save the changes and run the project once more. My project is up and running, and just with domain name of the application or web server, it is home index view. And if I switch to home, it is still home index. And if I switch to home index, it is still home index action method. Also, you can apply the route in controller level. I can here add a route and use home. And in this way, this route is no longer required. And also this one is no longer needed. Let me run the project with the changes that I have applied. You can see with just server name or domain name, I receive 404, but if I switch to home, I receive home index. And also if I switch to home index, it is still the home index action method is working, and the view of home index is presenting. But for doing the default route of this action method and this controller, I should add this route as well. Tilde slash. When I use tilde, it means the root of project or the root of the server or the root of the domain name. Let's save these changes and run the project once more. And you can see it is working with the default routing, and it is still work with the home, and also it is working still with home index. If I switch to attribute routing, name of controller and name of action method are not important in routing. For example, if I change this controller name to some controller and change this action method to detail, this controller and this action method is accessible with home or with the just name of name server or domain name or home index. But here I should add a name of view and path of view, because in this situation, ASP.NET Core is looking for detailed view inside some controller. But if I add the path of view in view method, I can show you the name of controller and name of detail is no important element in path when I use attribute routing. Let me go to the views folder and home and index.cshtml, and let me run the project and see the result. You can see it is with default path home index is available, and if I wrote to home, it is the same, and home index, it is the same result. But while if I use conventional routing, this path should be sum and detailed. It means it should be accessible through this route, which is return 404 error. And with this changes, I want to show you that the name of action method and name of controller is no matter in attribute routing. But let's back to index and home controller to continue attribute routing. Another option that I have in attribute routing is using token instead of the fixed name. Here I use home as a controller name and as a part of path, but I can change it to controller token. And in this situation, the path is exactly the name of controller. Let's save the changes and see the result. And you can see it is with the default route is available, and with home is available, and also with home index is available. And also we have another token for action method name, which is action. And with this change, the same result again. also I'm able to move the action part of the path to controller level, and I can move the action token to controller level and delete the action in the action method. Let's save the changes and see the result. And you can see this is the default path, and also home, I received 404. I describe it why, and also home index, it is the result. Okay, let's talk about the reason that I received 404 error when I use name of web server and controller, because on that path I missed the action part, and action part is mandatory. For solving this issue, I can use this route, which is tilde home, and generally tilde means the root of the project or the root of the web server or the root of the domain. Let me save the changes and run the project. You can see this time my project and my action method is accessible with name of the web server and home, and also home index, which was available previously, and the issue solved with this route. Okay, let's implement attribute routing for cost controller. In cost controller, we try to implement routing with the tokens that I have described earlier. I use route and use both controller and action token to implement attribute routing. As long as I add these tokens to my controller, the element of this controller is accessible, same as conventional routing. We can try to have access to detail action method and list action method with the way that we access to these action method in conventional routing, because the route that I have added is the same, its behavior is the same as conventional routing. Let's save the project and run it and see the results. Cost detail is available, and cost list route is still available. But here, as you can see, I hard-coded the requested ID, but I can add this route here, which is ID, and here I receive ID, and here I request for entered ID. Let's run the project and see the result. I wrote to cost detail 1 and I receive ID 1, and I switch to ID 2 and receive information of cost ID 2. But if I entered cost detail without ID, as ID is mandatory, I receive 404 error. For solving this issue, I can make this route optional with add one question mark to end of this one, and also with question mark here, I make it optional, and also I add double question mark here and 1. It means if ID is null, you look for ID 1. Let's save it and run the project once more. And route to cost detail. You can see I receive ID 1. If you remember, I add one JavaScript file with one alarm, and this box is appear here because of that JavaScript file. And if I go to ID 2, I receive ID 2 information. But if I delete this part, as ID is optional, I can, by default, I receive ID 1 cost detail. As I mentioned, conventional routing is better option for MVC project. I marked all attribute routing and again switch to conventional routing for further sessions. For this purpose, I comment the attributes row that I entered, and also in a startup file I switch again to endpoint map default controller routing, and now I again switch to conventional routing. This is the conventional routing as described in session 12, and this is attribute routing that I described it in this session. That's it in this session, and thank you for watching us. Don't forget to follow us on our social media, which their link are available in a description of this video and also in our website, and also subscribe our channel. Once more, thank you for watching us.